Rain had been falling on the Smoky Mountains for 3 days straight when Lena Voss finally stopped running. She hadn't meant to collapse on a stranger's porch. She hadn't meant to do a lot of things that week, but her truck had fishtailed on the mud-slicked switchback above Cutter's Gap, rolled once into the drainage ditch, and when she'd crawled out through the shattered passenger window, with nothing but a canvas satchel clutched to her chest and both arms shaking so hard she couldn't feel her fingers, the nearest light in the whole black wall of trees had been the amber glow of a single oil lamp burning in a cabin window about 40 yards up a steep, root-tangled slope. She'd made it to the porch steps. That was all she'd made it to. The man who found her was named Wade Callum. She learned that later. In the first moment she was aware of him, all she registered was that he was enormous, standing in the open doorway, with a lantern held at shoulder height, studying her the way a person studies a trap they didn't set and aren't sure still live. He was somewhere in his late 30s, broad through the chest and shoulders in the way that comes from real work and not a gym, with dark hair that curled at his collar and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several weeks. His eyes, she would notice later, were a particular shade of dark brown that reminded her of creek water just after a hard rain, deep and unsettled and moving with things you couldn't quite see. "You alive?" he said. It was not the most poetic thing anyone had ever said to Lena Voss, but it was honest, and she had not encountered much honesty in the past 8 months. "Barely," she managed. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what she was doing on his porch in the middle of a Tennessee mountain rainstorm at 11 o'clock at night. He simply reached down and lifted her, and she was too far gone to protest. The cabin was a single large room that smelled of pine resin and old wood smoke, and something savory simmering on the back of a cast-iron stove. He set her on a low cot near the fire, pulled a wool blanket off a hook on the wall, and dropped it over her shoulders. Then he poured something hot into a tin mug and pressed it into her hands without a word. Lena held the mug and tried to remember how to breathe. She was wearing the same clothes she'd had on for 2 days. Jeans, waterlogged. A flannel shirt, soaked clean through. Over the flannel, a canvas field jacket 3 sizes too large that had once belonged to a man she was no longer allowed to think of without her chest going tight. The jacket had deep interior pockets, and in those pockets she had been carrying, since Tuesday, something that could get her killed. She knew this because someone had already tried. The man, Wade, sat down across from her at a rough-hewn wooden table and folded his hands on the surface and looked at her in a way that was not unkind but was not soft either. He had the look of someone who had learned a long time ago not to waste words. "You need a doctor?" "No." "Your truck's in the ditch, up on the 8. "I know." "You want to tell me what happened?" She looked at him over the rim of the mug. The fire popped. Rain lashed the single window. "Not especially," she said. He nodded like that was a reasonable answer, and turned back to whatever he'd been doing at the table before she'd arrived, which appeared to be cleaning the action of a lever-action rifle with a cloth and a small bottle of gun oil. His hands moved with the unhurried competence of someone who had done this 10,000 times and found it meditative. Lena watched him and felt, for the first time in 72 hours, something in her shoulders begin to descend. She shouldn't have felt that. She knew better. She had walked into a strange man's cabin in the mountains in the middle of the night, and she knew nothing about him except that he owned a firearm and was comfortable with silence. By every reasonable measure, this was not a safe situation. But the reasonable part of her brain had gone very quiet sometime around Tuesday. That was when she'd opened her stepfather's locked desk drawer with a letter opener and found the ledger. She pulled the blanket tighter and didn't look at the jacket. He let her sleep. When she woke, pale gray morning light was pressing against the window glass. The fire had been banked low, and the smell of coffee had replaced the rain. Her jacket was still on her, still buttoned. She checked the interior pockets with her right hand before she'd even fully opened her eyes. Still there. Wade was at the stove, his back to her, pouring coffee into 2 mugs, with the same economy of motion he'd applied to everything else. He set one on the small table beside the cot without looking at her, which she appreciated. "Roads'll be clear enough by mid-morning," he said, "if you've got somewhere to be." "I do," she said. Then, after a pause, "I don't have a vehicle anymore. I noticed dare a bus line from town. There's a general store at Yancey's Crossing. Fellow there might drive you to Asheville for $20 if you ask right." He paused. "Or if you've got business that needs to wait for a day or two, you're welcome here." She looked at him. He was still not looking at her. He was doing something at the counter, slicing what appeared to be bread. "Why?" she said. He did turn then, briefly, and gave her a look that was somewhere between patient and tired. "Because it's raining and you're a woman, alone on my mountain, and I don't have anywhere to be. That's the whole of it. You can take the offer or not." She took the offer. She told herself it was because her ribs hurt when she breathed, which was true. She'd cracked at least one on the door frame of the truck, and because she needed one day, just one quiet day, to figure out how to get from Yancey's Crossing to the federal courthouse in Knoxville, with a ledger in her jacket and no way to know who was already looking for her. The truth, which she didn't let herself examine too closely, was that something about the cabin felt like the first solid ground she'd stood on in months. By afternoon, the rain had softened to a steady mist, and she was sitting near the window watching the fog move through the hemlocks when Wade came in from outside carrying an armload of split wood. He stacked it near the stove with efficient, practiced motions, and then turned and caught her watching him. "You keep looking at that jacket," he said. Lena went still. "Every time you move, your hand goes to the front of it." He wasn't accusing, he was just stating a thing he'd observed. "Whatever you're carrying, you're scared of it." "I'm not scared of it," she said. "I'm scared of the people who know I have it." He sat down in the chair across from her. He leaned forward with his forearms on his knees, and he looked at her steadily. "You in trouble with the law?" "No," she said. "I am the law, or I'm trying to be." She laughed, a short, hollow sound. "I'm trying to get something to people who can actually do something with it." He was quiet for a moment. "And the people chasing you, they're not people who like inconvenient truths. Who are they?" She looked at him for a long moment, measuring. She didn't know him. She knew almost nothing about him except that he hadn't hurt her, and he hadn't asked for anything, and he'd handed her a cup of something hot when she'd been lying on his porch in the rain. She knew that he lived alone up here, that the cabin had the settled, self-sufficient quality of a life that had deliberately turned its back on something. She thought about the ledger in her pocket, about the names in it, about the column of numbers beside each name, about what those numbers meant, what they had bought, and who had paid them. One of the names in that ledger was Callum, not Wade. The name above it was printed in her stepfather's careful, slanted handwriting, R. Callum, and beside it a payment, a date, and a two-word notation in the margin that her stepfather used for only one category of transaction: debt cleared. "What's your first name?" she said. "Wade." "Wade. And your father's name?" Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, the way a change in weather is subtle before you feel it, a slight tightening at the corners of his eyes, a stillness that hadn't been there before. "Raymond," he said. "Why?" The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Lena's hand went to the front of her jacket. She pressed her palm flat against the canvas without thinking, and she watched Wade's eyes follow the movement. "Where is he?" she said carefully. "Your father." "Dead," Wade said. 7 years ago." A pause. "Car went off a mountain road in the middle of the night. They called it an accident." Lena felt the floor shift under her. "They called it an accident," she repeated. "That's what the report said." His voice had not changed in volume or tone, but there was something underneath it now, something that had been there a long time and had calcified. "I never believed it." Her hands were trembling. She was aware of this, the way you're aware of something happening to someone else. She unbuttoned the jacket. "Don't," she said, before she decided to say it. And then she stopped, because it was already happening, and because she'd been running for 3 days with this thing inside her coat, and there was no one else on this mountain, and she was so tired. "I found something," she said instead, "in my stepfather's office. I wasn't supposed to find it. I think he knows I have it." Wade hadn't moved. He was watching her with the focused stillness of a man who has learned to wait. "His name is Harlan Fitch," she said. "He married my mother when I was 14. He's a county commissioner, chairs 3 boards. Everybody in our part of the valley thinks he's the second coming of civic virtue." Phew, rifted the jacket and pulled out the ledger. It was small, bound in dark green cloth, the kind of book you could buy at any stationer's. It didn't look like anything. He's been taking money from a land clearing operation for 20 years. Bribery. Fraud. They needed permits that weren't legal, and he provided them, and they paid him, and he kept a record of every single payment, because men like Harlan Fitch are meticulous and arrogant, and they never believe they'll be caught. She set the ledger on the table between them. "Your father's name is in here," she said. "F.R. Callum, with a date and a payment and a notation. I think—" She stopped. She made herself say it. "I think your father found out what Harlan was doing. I think he went to confront him. And I think that's what the road that night was really about." The silence in the cabin was absolute except for the low hiss of the banked fire. Wade did not reach for the ledger. He looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. The way you look at a door you have suspected for years has something behind it, and now someone is finally, irrevocably, offering you the handle. "How long have you known?" he said. "Since Tuesday. 4 days." She exhaled. "I've been trying to get to Knoxville, to the federal prosecutor's office. Harlan has influence everywhere. Local but federal is outside his—" She stopped, because Wade had stood up. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to her, looking out at the fog and the hemlocks, and she watched the muscles across his shoulders move as he breathed. "He came to the funeral," Wade said, very quietly. "Harlan Fitch came to my father's funeral and shook my hand and told me Raymond was a good man and the valley was the poorer for losing him." He paused. I shook his hand back. "I'm sorry," Lena said. She meant it in more ways than one. The sound came without warning. It was the sound of tires on wet gravel, and it came from somewhere below the cabin, down the slope where the logging road cut through the hemlocks. Wade heard it half a second before Lena did, and turned from the window with a sharpness that told her this was not a sound he expected. "You said your stepfather knows you have it," he said. "He knows I took something. He doesn't know exactly what. He know you were on that road last night." Lena felt the cold climb her spine. "He knows what road I'd take out of the valley." Wade moved to the corner of the room and pulled back a section of braided rug to reveal a floor hatch. From the shallow space beneath, he lifted a worn shotgun and a box of shells, and he moved with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had considered exactly this moment and decided long ago what they would do when it came. "How many people does he run with?" he said, loading the shotgun with quick, practiced movements. "He has 2 men who handle things. Orrin, who manages his properties, and a man everyone calls Pace. I don't know his real name. They've been with him since before he married my mother." 2 men. Wade handed her a heavy flashlight. "Are they armed?" "Always." He looked at her directly then. "Can you run if you need to?" "My ribs are cracked." "That's not what I asked." She met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "I can run." He nodded. He moved to the door and lifted the heavy crossbar, setting it in its iron brackets, and then went to the window and looked down the slope. Lena came to stand beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off him in the cold air of the cabin. Below, through the mist and the dark shapes of the hemlocks, she could see the gray shape of a vehicle parked on the logging road. Two figures were getting out. He came himself, she said, surprised. Course he did, Wade said low. A man like that doesn't trust anyone else to clean up a mess this size. Through the gray drizzle, she could make out Harlan Fitch's distinctive posture, the stiff, self-important set of his shoulders, the way he walked, like every room he entered had been rearranged for his arrival, even out here in the mud and the wet, even now. He's going to say you're harboring a disturbed young woman, Lena said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her. He's going to say I stole from him. He's going to say I'm not well. She paused. He said that before, about other things. People believed him. I'm not people, Wade said. A voice came up from the slope. Harlan's voice, projected with the practiced confidence of a man who addressed public meetings and ribbon cuttings and county board sessions. I know you're up there. I know you found her. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want my stepdaughter back safe. She's been through a hard time. She's confused. A pause, and I'd appreciate if the gentleman who's been kind enough to take her in would step outside and talk this through like reasonable men. Wade glanced at the ledger on the table. He glanced at Lena. Confused, he said. He's been saying it for 2 years. Anything I contradict, anything I challenge, she's confused. She misunderstood. She's been difficult since her mother passed. She kept her voice flat. It works. He's very good at it. Wade turned to the window. Raymond Callum was my father, he said, his voice raised enough to carry down the slope, flat as iron. I've been waiting 7 years for someone to tell me what really happened to him on that road. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. It had a texture to it, the specific, airless quality of a man recalculating. I don't know what she's told you, son, but I've found the ledger, Lena called out. She hadn't planned to, but she was done with being managed. I have it right here. R. Callum. August 14th. Debt cleared. I know what that means, Harlan. I know what you did. The figure on the slope went very still. Then he said something low to the 2 men beside him. Wade pulled her back from the window. Get down. The first shot came through the glass a half-second later, shattering the lower pane and thudding into the log wall above the stove. Lena hit the floor hard, her cracked ribs screaming, and pressed herself behind the overturned kitchen table that Wade had kicked into position with one boot in a single fluid motion. The shotgun roared from above her. Wade had positioned himself at the side of the window frame, not in front of it, and he fired twice in rapid succession through the broken glass before dropping below the sill to reload. Outside, someone cried out, the sound of footsteps in wet gravel, scrambling, retreating. Then Harlan's voice again, closer now from the side of the structure. You don't understand what you're involved in, boy. This is bigger than one old ledger. You give me that book and walk away and I'll make sure your name stays clean. You've lived up here quiet long enough. I'll leave you alone. You have my word. Wade said nothing. The girl is the problem. The girl has always been the problem. Elena. His voice shifted, adopted the warm, reasoning tone she had grown up hearing at the dinner table, the one that had made her question her own memory for 2 years. Elena, I know you're upset. I know you miss your mother, but you are holding something that you don't fully understand, and people are going to get hurt. Is that what you want? Lena sat with her back against the log wall and her hands around the ledger, and she listened to the voice of the man who had called himself her family for 6 years, and she felt something in her chest do something it hadn't done in a long time. It hardened. She looked at Wade, crouched below the window with the shotgun cradled across his knees. He was watching her. Waiting, she realized, to see what she would do. Not to see if she'd break, just to see who she was. He's going to try the back, she said, keeping her voice low. He did that once before, when my mother tried to leave him. He went around. Wade handed her his hunting knife without a word and moved toward the back of the cabin. She followed. The back door had a simple iron latch, and they could hear the crunch of a single set of footsteps circling through the wet brush outside. Pace, the man she'd never learned the real name of, moving fast. Wade stood to the left of the door. Lena stood to the right, her ribs burning, her hands steady. The latch rattled. Then a shoulder hit the door, hard. Wade let it come. He waited until the door burst inward and the figure filled the frame, and then he moved with the sudden, absolute efficiency of someone who had spent years alone in the mountains with nothing to do but be ready. And the man called Pace went down in the mud outside before he'd fully registered that anything had happened. 2. Lena was already moving. She had heard Harlan's footsteps on the front porch. She knew that tread, had heard it above her head on the floor of her childhood bedroom, had learned to tell from its weight and pace what mood he was in and how much of herself to hide, and she moved back through the cabin toward the front window with the ledger pressed against her chest. Harlan had the remaining man with him. They were at the porch steps. Through the broken window she could see Harlan had a pistol in his hand, which was new. She had never seen him hold a weapon before. He had always had other people do that. He was losing control of the situation, and men like Harlan Fitch, she knew, were most dangerous precisely when that happened. She heard Wade come through the cabin behind her fast. She stepped up to the window. "Harlan," she said. He turned. She held up the ledger so he could see it clearly. And then she looked past him, at the logging road below, where a second vehicle had appeared through the mist, a dark SUV with government plates that had come quietly up the road behind Harlan's car while everyone's attention was directed at the cabin. 2 figures in rain gear were climbing the slope. The figure in front had a badge clipped to her belt. Lena had called the federal prosecutor's office from a gas station payphone on Monday night, before she'd even reached the Valley Road. She had given them the address of every property her stepfather owned within 40 miles of the county line. She had told them that if she went silent to start at the mountain roads. She hadn't told anyone this. She had learned, living under Harlan Fitch's roof, that the most important things were the ones you didn't say out loud. Harlan saw the SUV. She watched him see it, watched the specific, terrible moment when the calculation behind his eyes ran its numbers and came up with an answer he could not maneuver around. He lowered the pistol. He lowered it slowly, with the deliberate, controlled motion of a man who was already composing his next version of events, already deciding who he was going to be in the story that followed. But the ledger was in Lena's hands, and the woman with the badge was 20 yards away in closing, and there was no version of this story that he could author anymore. The agents reached the porch. They took Harlan Fitch by both arms with the brisk, impersonal competence of people doing a necessary thing, and they walked him down the slope in the gray morning drizzle, and Lena stood at the broken window and watched him go. She was aware, distantly, that she was shaking. Her ribs hurt with every breath. Her hair was wet and her boots were soaked, and she had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours in 4 days. She was also aware of Wade, standing just behind her and to the right. She turned. He was looking out the window at the figures moving down the slope, and his expression was not triumph and not relief. It was something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. The face of a man who had just watched a locked door open and found himself uncertain, for the first time in years, what to do with the room that was on the other side. "They'll want to ask you about your father," she said, "about the date in the ledger, about what you know." "I know he was honest," Wade said, "and I know he died for it." He paused. "That's enough to start with." She held out the ledger to the agent, who'd appeared in the doorway behind them. A woman with careful eyes and a voice that asked questions the way you handle something fragile. Lena answered every question. She did not look away from any of them. When it was over, when the agents had gone back down the slope with Harlan's men in restraints and the gray morning had shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward something that felt less like rain and more like the particular silver light that comes after a storm passes. Lena sat back down on the cot near the stove. Her jacket was on the hook by the door. The pocket that had held the ledger was empty. Wade set a mug of coffee on the table beside her without being asked. He sat down across from her in the same way he had the night before, forearms on knees, unhurried. "You called them before you even came up this road," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Monday night," she said, "before I left the valley." It was quiet for a moment. "You didn't know you were going to end up here?" "No." "Could have ended up anywhere." "Yes." He looked at the window. Outside, the mist was beginning to pull back from the hemlock canopy, and the first real light of morning was finding its way through the gap. "My father kept a journal," he said. "I found it after he died. He wrote about a man in the county who was pressuring him. He never named him. I always thought that was strange. Raymond Callum named everything. He was precise about things." He paused. "I think now he didn't name him because he was afraid of what would happen to the journal if he did. He was protecting whoever found it." "He was protecting you," Lena said. Wade didn't answer that. He picked up his mug and looked at it for a moment. "His name's in a federal ledger now," he said. "It is. People will know he didn't just go off a road." "They'll know," she said. He nodded. He looked out the window where the hemlock branches were beginning to emerge from the mist, dark green against the lightening sky, as solid and unhurried as the mountain itself. Lena drank her coffee. Her ribs still hurt. She had nowhere to go that was safe yet, and a great deal still to be sorted out, and a stepfather who would find ways to be difficult even from custody, because men like Harlan Fitch always did. She knew all of this. She also knew that the empty pocket felt lighter than the full one had. 2 weeks later, when the roads were dry and the federal case had grown large enough to take on its own momentum, Lena came back up the mountain. She hadn't planned to. She'd told herself she was driving through on the way to somewhere else, which was technically true in the way that a lot of things she told herself were technically true. She parked on the logging road below the cabin and climbed the slope on foot, and when she reached the porch, she stood for a moment looking at the new glass in the window frame, the fresh lumber where the door had been repaired, the careful, competent evidence of a man who fixed what was broken and expected nothing to stay intact indefinitely. Wade came around the side of the cabin with an armload of wood before she'd knocked. He saw her. He stopped. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "You could have sent a letter," he said. "I could have," she agreed. He looked at her steadily, the dark creekwater eyes that moved with things underneath. "You staying for coffee?" he asked. She looked up at the sky, which was clear in a way that Tennessee skies are clear in late October, a hard, brilliant blue that you don't find anywhere else, the kind of blue that makes you aware that the mountain is still there under your feet, whether you've been paying attention or not. "Yeah," she said. "I think I am. I keep thinking about the moment Lena set that ledger on the table. Not the gunfire. Not the moment Harlan went down the slope in handcuffs. The quiet moment before any of that, when she put the thing she'd been protecting with her whole body down on a stranger's table and let him see it. That took something most people never find. Because it wasn't just a book. It was the proof that she'd been right all along, and that being right had nearly gotten her killed. What strikes me most about Lena's story isn't the courage it took to steal the ledger. It's the thinking behind it. She called the federal prosecutor's office before she even left the valley, before she knew how bad the roads would be, before she knew how bad the roads would be, before she knew her truck would go into a ditch, before she knew Wade Callum existed. She planned for the possibility that she wouldn't make it, and she did it quietly, without telling a soul, because she understood something that most of us learn too late, that the people who want to silence you are counting on you to announce your moves. She didn't. That's not luck. That's a kind of clear-eyed intelligence that only comes from paying attention to the world as it actually is, not as you wish it were. And then there's the part about her ribs. She told Wade she could run when he asked, even though every breath hurt. She didn't say it to be brave. She said it because it was true in the way that mattered. She would run if she had to, pain and all. That's the thing about real endurance. It doesn't wait until conditions are favorable, it works with what's available. Lena had been doing that for 2 years inside Harlan's house, learning to hold her face still, learning to wait, learning to be smaller than she was so that she could survive long enough to do the one thing that needed doing. Harlan Fitch believed that a person's value could be managed, reduced, reframed, explained away. He did it to Lena for years. He called it concern. He called it confusion. And it worked, because he was powerful and she was young, and the world around her found it easier to believe the man in the good suit. But here's what Harlan never understood about the choice he made the night Raymond Callum drove off that mountain road. Consequences don't care about your reputation. They accumulate quietly, the way water gets into stone, and eventually the stone gives. Lena didn't destroy Harlan Fitch because she was angry. She did it because it was right and because she had enough respect for herself, and for Raymond Callum's memory, and for Wade's 7 years of unanswered grief, to see it through regardless of the cost. That's the thing about doing the right thing when it's actually hard. It doesn't feel heroic in the moment. It feels like cracked ribs and wet boots and not enough sleep and not knowing if it's going to work. It worked. And when she came back up that mountain 2 weeks later, she didn't go back for closure or resolution or any of the clean words we use when we want a story to mean something tidy. She went back because she'd spent years being invisible, and she had finally, painfully, become someone she recognized. Wade saw that person clearly the first night she showed up on his porch. Sometimes that's all any of us are looking for, someone who sees us straight without adjusting what they find.